In the middle of a lavish engagement party, Priscilla suddenly poured an entire can of paint over Clara's head, the young maid who had spent years serving in that very house. Priscilla coldly ordered Clara to kneel and clean the marble floor before the stain could set. Not a single guest dared to intervene, but from the top of the staircase, billionaire Damien had already seen everything unfold. He walked down slowly, took off his jacket, and covered Clara's shoulders. Then he demanded the band stop playing and every door be locked. What Damien did next left hundreds of guests speechless. Before we get into what happened next, if stories like this keep you hooked till the very end, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. Now let's get back to the story. Clara Bennett had learned long ago that the sun rose for other people, for her mornings began in darkness in the hush of a mansion still asleep when she moved through corridors wider than the apartment she shared with her sister and folded linens no one would ever thank her for touching. She was 26 years old, though the weight she carried made her feel decades older, and every task she completed before breakfast was really just another brick laid toward a single quiet goal, making sure Nora, her 14-year-old sister, never had to know what it felt like to go without. Their mother had died when Nora was still small and their father had left even before that, so it had always been the two of them propped up by whatever Clara could earn. She had taken the job at the Cross estate 3 years earlier, drawn by the pay and terrified by how much she needed it. She scrubbed floors that cost more than her mother's funeral, served meals to guests who never bothered to learn her name, and told herself that dignity was a luxury she could not currently afford. What she allowed herself instead was a smaller, steadier hope that if she simply endured long enough, Nora would grow up somewhere safer than where they had started. On the nights when the work felt heaviest, Clara would sit at the edge of Nora's bed after her sister had fallen asleep, listening to the quiet, even sound of her breathing, and remind herself that this at least was something no employer could take from her. She had built her entire sense of purpose around that small, steady rhythm, around report cards and school shoes and the particular way Nora laughed when something struck her as genuinely funny. It was a fragile kind of peace, built on long hours and swallowed pride, but it was hers, and for 3 years, it had been enough to carry her through almost anything the estate demanded of her. Damien did not know most of this, not in detail, though he was not a man who moved through his own house blind to the people in it. He addressed his staff by name, thanked them for work most employers considered invisible, and had built a quiet, unspoken rule that no one under his roof was to be humiliated for the crime of serving him. He traveled often, closing deals across time zones, and it was during those long absences that a certain distance crept into his understanding of his own home. He noticed vaguely that Clara had grown quieter over the past several months, that her eyes dropped a little faster than they used to, but a man running an empire rarely questions why a maid looks tired. Priscilla Kingsley had been raised to believe that a person's worth could be measured in the cut of their dress and the weight of their last name, and nothing in her life had ever seriously challenged that belief. In public, she was radiant, generous with her smile, careful with her charity donations and her photographs. Behind the doors of the estate, she was preparing to call her own. However, something colder took over, a woman who corrected servants in a voice just sharp enough to remind them of their place. She had not always aimed that coldness at Clara specifically. That would come later, and it would come for a reason that to Priscilla felt entirely reasonable. It began as small fractures often do, with a compliment that was never meant to wound anyone. During a private dinner with two of Damien's business partners, he mentioned almost in passing that Clara was the only person in the house who remembered exactly how he liked his coffee without ever being told twice. It was nothing, a throwaway observation meant to illustrate loyalty in his staff, the kind of remark a man makes without thinking. Priscilla smiled at the table, laughed along with the guests, and said nothing. But later that night, Dorothy, the housekeeper, who had managed the estate for over 15 years, watched Priscilla's eyes follow Clara across the room for just a moment too long, and she understood before anyone else did that something had shifted. Dorothy had seen many things in her years at the estate, and she recognized the particular danger in a woman who felt threatened by someone with far less power than herself. She pulled Clara aside not long after, and warned her gently to keep her distance from Priscilla whenever possible, to avoid being alone with her if she could help it. Clara nodded and thanked her, but she did not fully understand the warning yet, not until a few days later, when Priscilla called her into the dressing room under the pretense of inspecting her work. Priscilla took her time that afternoon, running her fingers along the seams of a freshly pressed gown, searching for a flaw that did not exist. The dressing room smelled of lavender and expensive candle wax, and Clara stood near the door, with her hands folded in front of her the way Dorothy had taught new staff to stand when waiting to be addressed. When Priscilla failed to find a single loose thread, she set the gown down slowly and turned to face Clara directly, tilting her head as though studying an object rather than a person. "You must think you're very good at your job," Priscilla said, her voice light, almost pleasant. "Damien certainly seems to think so." Clara said nothing, sensing the trap folded inside the compliment. Priscilla stepped closer and added softer now, that some women were simply born knowing how to bow their heads because life had never given them any other option, and that there was no shame in it, only a kind of fact. Clara felt the words land somewhere, just beneath her ribs. But she only lowered her eyes and apologized for a mistake she had not made, because arguing with a woman about to become the lady of the house was a battle she could not afford to win. It was the first time Priscilla had drawn blood without lifting a hand, and she seemed to enjoy the discovery more than she expected to. The third moment came only days before the engagement party, when Priscilla instructed Clara to clean Damien's private study while he was away on business, a room the staff understood without ever being told directly was not to be entered without his explicit permission. Clara hesitated, and then carefully she declined, explaining that she was afraid of breaking a rule Damien himself had set. It was a small refusal offered with as much respect as she could manage, but Priscilla did not hear respect. She heard a maid correcting her in her own future home, as though she did not already understand the boundaries of the house she was about to inherit. She said nothing more that day, but she filed the moment away like a debt to be collected. Dorothy urged Clara more firmly this time to bring the pattern of these incidents to Damien directly before something worse happened. Clara considered it for a long night, turning the idea over while Nora slept in the next room, but fear won out in the end. If she complained and Damien sided with the woman he was about to marry, she would not only lose her dignity, she would lose the job that kept her sister fed and in school. So she chose, as she always had, to carry the weight quietly and hope it would not grow heavier. It grew heavier anyway, arriving all at once on the night of the engagement party, an event Priscilla had spent months designing as proof to the world that she belonged at the center of the Cross family's world. Hundreds of guests filled the estate that evening, businessmen and celebrities and members of the city's oldest families all gathered beneath chandeliers Priscilla had chosen herself. In the grand hall, an artist had been commissioned to complete a live painting throughout the night. A keepsake of the occasion, and cans of vivid paint sat arranged near the stage where he worked. Before the first guests arrived, Priscilla assigned Clara to oversee that exact section of the hall, the space nearest the painting display closest to the crowded walkway, where servers moved quickly with trays balanced high above the guests. It was on the surface an ordinary task among many others that night. Dorothy recognized it instantly for what it truly was, a quiet trap built from 3 earlier humiliations. One final opportunity for Priscilla to make her point in front of everyone who mattered to her. Clara understood the risk as well, but refusing an assignment on the night of her employer's engagement would only confirm every suspicion Priscilla already held against her, so she accepted the post and prayed the evening would pass, without incident. For a while it seemed as though it might. The party moved through its early hours smoothly, laughter rising over string music, champagne glasses catching the light beneath crystal chandeliers Priscilla had spent an entire month selecting. Clara stood near the painting display as instructed, watching the artist's brush move in slow, confident strokes across the canvas, and for the first time all evening she allowed herself to feel something close to calm. Guests drifted past her without a glance the way they always did, and she told herself that perhaps this night would simply end the way most nights did, quietly, with her feet aching and her name unremembered. Then near the painting display, a young server lost his footing against a display stand, sending a tray of champagne crashing into the very section Clara had been placed to watch. Paint splattered faintly across the marble floor beside the wreckage, and in an instant Priscilla was already moving toward the noise, already searching the crowd for the one person she had positioned there to fail. She found Clara standing near the mess, not because she had caused it, but because overseeing that section had been her only assignment all night. Priscilla's voice rose above the music before Clara could even explain herself, accusing her of incompetence, of ruining the most important night of her life, of forgetting her place inside a house that was never truly hers to begin with. Clara tried to speak, to explain that another server had caused the fall, but every word she offered sounded, to the watching crowd, like a woman scrambling to shift blame onto someone else. Dorothy stepped forward to speak on her behalf, but Priscilla's raised hand silenced her before she could say a single word. In that narrow, suffocating silence, Clara felt something shift quietly inside her chest. She thought of the dressing room of the study she had refused to enter, of every small cruelty she had swallowed in the name of keeping her job and protecting her sister, and she understood perhaps for the first time that her patience had never earned her safety, only more room for Priscilla to take. Still, with Nora's face rising in her mind, she chose silence again. Because silence had always felt safer than the alternative. It was not enough. When Clara failed to drop to her knees and beg forgiveness for a mistake that was not hers, Priscilla felt the eyes of the entire hall pressing on her, waiting to see if she would be obeyed. She reached for the nearest can of white paint without a flicker of hesitation and poured it directly over Clara's head in front of hundreds of the city's most powerful people. The room fell into a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the music itself. Paint dripping down Clara's hair, her face the uniform she had worn with quiet pride for 3 years. Priscilla was not finished. She threw a cloth to the floor at Clara's feet and ordered her to kneel to scrub the stain away before it ruined the imported marble beneath them. Clara stood frozen between two impossible choices: refuse and risk the only income keeping her sister housed and educated, or kneel and lose whatever remained of her own sense of worth in front of everyone watching. Slowly, achingly, she began to lower herself toward the cloth on the floor. Before her knees could touch the marble, a voice cut through the silence from the top of the staircase, steady and unmistakable. Damien Cross had seen everything. Damien came down the staircase without hurrying, without raising his voice, as though the 200 guests frozen around him did not exist at all. He reached Clara before she could finish kneeling and gently caught her by the shoulders, lifting her back to her feet with a steadiness that made it clear he had already decided what came next. He shrugged off his jacket and settled it over her, covering the paint that had soaked through her uniform, and for a moment his hand rested lightly on her arm, as though grounding her back into a room that had just tried to erase her. He turned to Dorothy, who was already moving toward them, and asked her to take Clara to the room adjoining the hall to check whether the paint had burned her eyes or skin, and to stay with her until he came. Clara did not resist. She let herself be led away, grateful for even a few minutes out of the hundreds of staring eyes, though she could still hear the silence behind her, heavy and unnatural, pressing against the back of her neck like a held breath. Priscilla recovered, first smoothing the front of her dress as though composing herself for a photograph, and stepped quickly toward Damien before he could say anything to the room. She kept her voice low, urgent, insisting that Clara had ruined months of planning, that she had only meant to teach an employee a lesson about responsibility, and that surely he did not intend to turn one small accident into a scandal in front of every guest who mattered to their future together. A few of her closest friends drifted closer as well, murmuring that whatever needed to be discussed could wait until morning, that no one wanted to see two respected families embarrassed over a household matter. Damien did not argue with any of them. He did not raise his voice or accuse Priscilla of anything in front of the crowd. Instead, he lifted one hand toward the band still frozen mid-song and asked them calmly to stop playing. He asked the waitstaff to set down their trays and stand still. He asked every guest by name where he knew it, and by gesture where he did not, to remain exactly where they stood. It was the stillness of his voice, more than any anger could have been, that made Priscilla's confidence begin to crack at the edges. When the hall had gone completely quiet, Damien did not immediately confront her. Instead, he asked that every member of the household staff be brought into the grand hall, from the kitchen to the gardens to the private wing upstairs. Guests exchanged uncertain glances as maids, groundskeepers, and kitchen staff filed in slowly, unsure why they had been summoned into a room full of people who had never looked twice at them. Once they had gathered, Damien turned to face them all and asked a single question, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. He wanted to know if anyone standing there had ever been insulted, threatened, or humiliated by Priscilla during the times he had been away from home. For a long moment, no one moved. Priscilla straightened, a small, confident smile returning to her face, certain that fear would keep every mouth in that room sealed shut. She had, after all, spent years making sure her staff understood exactly what it would cost them to speak against her. Dorothy was the one who broke the silence. She stepped forward with the calm authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard in that house, and she described in careful detail an evening months earlier when Priscilla had docked an entire month's wages from a young housemaid over nothing more than the arrangement of pillows on a guest bed, and had threatened to have her dismissed if she dared mention it to Damien. The room absorbed this in silence, and something in the air shifted, as though a single crack had opened a door that could not be closed again. After Dorothy, an older groundskeeper stepped forward, his hands still rough with soil from the garden he tended every day. He explained that Priscilla had once accused him of killing a rare orchid through neglect when in truth she herself had watered it incorrectly and blamed him rather than risk Damien's disappointment. Then came the head chef, a broad-shouldered man who rarely spoke above a murmur, who admitted that Priscilla had once berated him in front of his own young son, who had come to visit him during his shift, using words he refused to repeat in front of the boy again. A young woman from the laundry staff spoke next, her voice barely audible at first, gaining strength only as she continued. She described an afternoon when Priscilla had thrown an entire basket of freshly folded linens onto the floor because a single pillowcase had been creased, forcing her to redo 3 hours of work without any acknowledgement that the mistake, if it existed at all, was minor and human. Each account landed heavier than the last, not because the details were dramatic, but because of how ordinary the cruelty had become, woven so seamlessly into the daily rhythm of the house that no single person had ever thought to name it aloud until now. Finally, the young server whose stumble had started the entire evening stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He admitted that only an hour before the party began, he had personally overheard Priscilla instructing the household staff to place Clara in charge of the most crowded, most hazardous section of the hall, the one nearest the painting display, and that at the time he had assumed it was simply bad luck, rather than a deliberate setup. Priscilla interrupted him sharply, insisting he was lying, accusing the entire staff of conspiring with Clara to destroy her engagement out of jealousy or spite. Her voice climbed higher with every denial, but the more she protested, the more the room seemed to lean away from her rather than toward her. Damien allowed every account to be spoken in full before he moved again. Then he turned toward the enormous screen at the front of the hall, the one originally prepared to display photographs from the evening's celebration, and nodded to a technician standing quietly near the wall. The screen flickered to life with security footage instead, time-stamped from earlier that same night, showing the exact section of the hall where the accident had occurred. The footage made it unmistakably clear that Clara had not caused the fall that started everything, and moments later it showed Priscilla herself lifting the can of paint and walking deliberately toward Clara before pouring it over her head. Without hesitation, no one in the hall spoke. Guests who had laughed at Priscilla's jokes an hour earlier now stared at the screen with expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet judgment. Every excuse Priscilla had offered in the past several minutes crumbled at once, replaced by the plain, unavoidable evidence playing above her head for everyone to witness. Priscilla seemed to understand in that moment that denial was no longer an option available to her. Her expression shifted quickly, tears rising to her eyes as she turned toward the crowd and began speaking of the unbearable pressure she had carried in the months leading up to the wedding, the expectations placed on her by both families, the fear of never being considered good enough to stand beside a man like Damien. She moved toward Clara, arms lifting, as though to embrace her, the beginning of an apology already forming on her lips. Clara stepped back before Priscilla could reach her. She had spent 3 years learning to read the difference between sincerity and performance in the voices of people who had power over her, and she recognized instantly that this apology was not meant for her at all. It was meant for the room, for the cameras. Someone in the crowd had surely already raised for the engagement. Priscilla could feel slipping through her fingers. Priscilla turned back to Damien instead, her voice breaking as she begged him not to destroy their future over a single moment of poor judgment. Members of her own family moved closer as well, reminding him quietly that ending things publicly, in front of business partners and lifelong friends, would damage relationships and agreements that had taken years to build between their two families. For a brief moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether Damien would choose the comfortable path or the harder one. Damien walked to the small stage where the artist's painting stood forgotten, the single white smear of paint still drying near its edge, and asked Priscilla to join him there in front of everyone. Guests assumed, watching his calm expression, that he intended to forgive her quietly and preserve the evening, the engagement, the fragile peace between two powerful families. Instead, he removed a small velvet box from his jacket, opened it, and placed the engagement ring gently on a nearby table rather than returning it to her hand. He told her in a voice steady enough to reach every corner of the silent hall that she still had one final chance to prove her apology meant something real. He asked her to stand before every member of the staff, to look each of them in the eye, and apologize without blaming pressure, family, or circumstance for what she had done. Then he said she would kneel beside Clara and help her clean the very stain she had created, not as punishment but so she might finally understand, in her own body, what she had asked another human being to do in front of a room full of strangers. Priscilla looked slowly around the hall at faces that had once admired her, applauded her charity work, praised her taste and her grace, all of them now waiting silently to see what she would do. Something in her expression hardened instead of softening. She told Damien flatly that she would never lower herself in front of people who worked for a living to survive, that her pride would not allow her to kneel for anyone regardless of what she had done. The words landed harder than the paint ever had. Damien lifted the ring from the table and closed the box around it, his voice quiet but final as he told her that he had never asked her to kneel before them. He had only offered her the chance to stand beside them as an equal, and even that she had refused. He announced simply and without theatrics that their engagement was over. No one in the grand hall said a single word. By the following morning, the video had already found its way beyond the walls of the estate. Someone among the guests had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone, and within a single day it had spread through every social circle. Priscilla had once belonged to shared and reshared until her name became inseparable from image of a paint can tipping over a stranger's head. She lost the engagement first, then the invitations to galas she had attended for years, then one by one, the friends who had once called her graceful and generous in equal measure. Rather than accept what the footage had revealed about her, Priscilla began telling a different story to anyone who would still listen. She insisted that Clara had spent months quietly working her way into Damien's affections, that the maid had orchestrated the entire humiliation to make herself appear sympathetic, and that the broken engagement was proof of a seduction rather than a reckoning. A handful of tabloid outlets seized on the narrative eagerly, painting Clara as the other woman in a scandal that had never actually involved romance of any kind between her and Damien. Reporters began appearing outside the small apartment. Clara shared with her sister, calling questions through the door, photographing her on her way to the bus stop as though she were the one who had done something wrong. The story followed Nora to school as well, where classmates who had seen the video online began repeating the ugliest version of it in the hallways, calling her sister names that had nothing to do with the truth Clara had lived every day for 3 years. One evening, Nora came home in tears before Clara had even finished changing out of her coat, and the sight of her sister's face broke something open in Clara that months of Priscilla's cruelty never had. Nora explained through halting breaths that a group of classmates had shown her the video during lunch, laughing as they called her sister names. Clara refused to even repeat inside her own mind. Then Nora asked the question that would stay with Clara long after that night ended. Her voice small and unsure, wanting to know if all of this suffering existed only because of her, because Clara had taken the job in the first place to support her. Clara pulled her sister close and held her without answering right away, searching for words that could carry the truth without adding to the weight Nora was already carrying. She told her eventually that none of this was because of her, that every difficult choice Clara had made over the past 3 years had been made freely out of love rather than obligation, but the words felt smaller than the pain they were bare and meant to comfort. Later that night, once Nora had finally fallen asleep, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table and understood with a clarity that frightened her that her silence had never protected either of them the way she believed it had. She wrote her resignation letter that same night, choosing each word carefully, thanking Damien for his kindness without ever mentioning what it had cost her to receive it. She believed in that quiet, exhausted hour that leaving the estate entirely was the only way to finally close the story the tabloids had built around her, the only way to give Nora a chance to be seen as something other than a rumor. She placed the letter on the kitchen counter, telling herself it was the responsible choice rather than the frightened one, and planned to deliver it the moment she found the courage to face him. Damien received the letter not long after, and something in its careful, grateful tone told him immediately how much damage had already been done beneath the surface of what he had witnessed at the party. He understood, reading it twice in his quiet office, that defending Clara, publicly in front of hundreds of guests, had not been enough to protect her from what came after, that the consequences of that single night were still unfolding in rooms he could not see. For the first time since the engagement had ended, he felt the full weight of how incomplete his response had actually been. He called a small press conference within the week, deliberately modest compared to the extravagance of the engagement party, inviting only a handful of trusted journalists rather than the wider spectacle Priscilla's version of events had created. Standing before them, he stated plainly that Clara Bennett had played no role whatsoever in the end of his engagement, that the decision had been entirely his own, made the moment he witnessed how Priscilla treated the people with the least power to defend themselves. He added, without softening it, that he bore some responsibility for not noticing the pattern of cruelty sooner, for trusting appearances over the quiet suffering of the people working under his own roof. He made it clear in careful and deliberate language that Clara owed him nothing, not gratitude, not loyalty, not an explanation for whatever she chose to do next with her life. The words were meant for the journalists in front of him, but more than that, they were meant to finally silence the version of the story that had followed Clara and her sister through their own front door for weeks. After the cameras had gone, Damien asked to see Clara privately, and when she arrived, he did not ask her to withdraw her resignation or return to the uniform she had worn for 3 years. Instead, he offered her something she had never imagined possible inside that house, a position within his company's newly expanding employee welfare division where her understanding of what it felt like to be unseen and unprotected could shape real policies rather than simply survive them. He described a role with better pay, stable hours, and opportunities to grow into responsibilities far beyond scrubbing floors and serving meals to people who never learned her name. Clara listened without answering right away, turning the offer over carefully in her mind, searching it for any trace of pity rather than genuine respect. She asked him directly whether this position existed, because he felt guilty about what had happened to her, and Damien answered just as directly, telling her that guilt might have opened the conversation, but her intelligence and her steadiness under pressure were what had convinced him she belonged there regardless of anything else. Only after she was certain the offer had nothing to do with charity did Clara finally accept it, folding her resignation letter away unused. Her first weeks in the welfare division were slower and quieter than she expected, filled with paperwork meetings and long afternoons reviewing complaints that other employees had been too afraid to file for years. She sat across from people who reminded her of herself only months earlier, people who apologized before they had even finished explaining what had been done to them, and she found that she knew exactly what to say to make them feel believed, rather than judged. It was strange. She thought how the very silence she had once carried like a burden had become the thing that made her useful to others carrying the same weight. In the weeks that followed, Damien established a scholarship fund for the children of everyone employed across his company quietly, without press releases or public announcements attached to his own name. Nora became one of its first recipients, chosen not because of who her sister was or what had happened at the party, but because her grades and her determination had already marked her as exactly the kind of student the fund was designed to support. When the acceptance letter arrived, Nora read it 3 times before she believed it was real, and for the first time in months, Clara watched her sister's face hold something closer to hope than exhaustion. That evening, Nora sat across from Clara at their small kitchen table, the same table where she had once asked whether all of their suffering existed only because of her, and she asked a different question this time. She wanted to know if Clara was proud of her, and Clara answered without hesitation that she had always been proud of her long before any scholarship or any acceptance letter arrived to prove it. Nora smiled, then a real smile, the kind Clara had not seen on her sister's face in longer than she wanted to admit, and something in Clara's chest finally loosened after months of holding itself tightly closed. Several months passed before Clara found herself standing in the same grand hall again, though this time she wore a tailored blazer instead of a uniform, attending a company event as a member of the welfare division rather than someone hired to serve it. She noticed near the far wall, the painting the artist had completed the night everything changed, still displayed exactly where it had been finished. A single streak of white paint remained visible near its edge, left untouched rather than painted over, and beneath it hung a small plaque bearing a short line the artist had chosen to add afterward. The plaque read simply that a person's true character reveals itself most clearly in the moment they believe no one important is watching them. Clara stood in front of it for a long moment, thinking of every quiet humiliation she had swallowed in that same room, of Nora's frightened question at their kitchen table, of the version of herself who used to lower her eyes before anyone had the chance to look at her directly. She realized, standing there in clothes that belonged entirely to her own effort, rather than anyone's charity, that she no longer recognized that version of herself at all. Dorothy still managed the estate, older now but sharper in ways that mattered, having watched every policy protecting the household staff grow stronger since the night Priscilla's cruelty had finally been dragged into the light. Priscilla herself had left the city entirely, her name rarely mentioned anymore, except as a quiet cautionary tale among the social circles that had once celebrated her. What cost her everything in the end was never the paint, never Clara, never even Damien's decision to end their engagement in front of hundreds of witnesses. It was her own refusal in the one moment that mattered most to see the people beneath her as anything close to equal. Clara walked slowly across the hall that evening past the same marble floor she had once been ordered to scrub on her knees, and this time she did not lower her eyes for anyone who passed her. She had not won, because Priscilla lost everything she once had. She had won because in the single moment she had been humiliated most completely in front of more people than she could count. She had refused to let that cruelty turn her into someone cruel in return. If this story reminded you that quiet dignity is still strength and that no one's worth is ever measured by the uniform they wear or the job they do, then you already understand exactly why we tell these stories. If you want more like this one, hit subscribe, tap that notification bell, and let us know in the comments what part of Clara's journey stayed with you the most. We'll see you in the next story.